Good. Welcome. My name is Felipe. I'm on the faculty of Bali College Law School, and I am absolutely thrilled to be your moderator for this really fascinating and it's going to be a really exciting panel on race and empire in international law. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists and give you a brief description of what the panel is meant to, the questions the panel is meant to engage. And then we will get started hearing from each of our panelists on some of their work and what they're thinking about in terms of this fielding question. So let me start first with the description. So the questions we're trying to get at here are, what are the contours of self-determination at a global scale? And one of the things that we're going to see here is, and the main sort of emphasis is going to be from our panelists and critical to the scholars I have here in my lab. We're going to be examining the dynamics of social control of empire in the overlapping context of militarism, debt relations, and climate crisis. The panelists are going to be surveying the fields and discussing the role of law in international political economy and suggest areas for urgent intervention in the transnational legal order. So each of our panelists are going to speak for about 10 minutes. And then we're going to switch over to a conversational sort of interaction between myself and the panelists among themselves that I'll moderate for about 25 minutes. And then we're going to move on to the Q&A open up to everybody for the last 20 minutes. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers today. So first we have Zohra Ahmed. Zohra is an assistant professor at the University of Georgia School of Law. She writes about the U.S. carceral state and U.S. military. To her left is Asli, who is professor of law at Yale Law School. And her research and teaching interests span international law and comparative constitutional law with a focus on the Middle East. To her left is Angela Harris. Angela is a professor emeritus of law at the University of California, Davis. She's also co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Political Economy. And then to her left is Ntina, who is an associate professor at the College of Law at the Australian National University. Her work focuses on the political economy of international law. So without any further ado, I will hand it over now first to
Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And I could not be more excited to be on this panel with these folks. I thought that I would give a kind of set of remarks that are about how we come to the particular questions that are in the title, because it's not necessarily obvious that we would come to specifically race, empire, and international law. And as we're going to talk about as we get going in this conversation, there's also a scalar dimension that we want to bring in that asks about the transnational and how domestic and international connect to one another. But the reason it's not obvious is because we have sort of twin conversations that have come to converge in some ways. There was, and I mean, this is partly just the literal intellectual history of bringing together groups of scholars to have conversations about their intersections and convergences. And so there was an attempt explicitly by those who are in the third world approaches to international law movement that was very much focused on empire and international law to turn their attention to race in particular as an analytic lens, because in many ways there were quite compelling critiques that Tzouvala had not done that explicitly. Now, I think it's important to note that most Tzouvala scholars, and again, Tzouvala, sorry, is the acronym for third world approaches to international law, understood themselves to be very much writing about race in the kind of classical global color line sense of to talk about colonialism and to talk about imperial projects, to talk about race as it operates in a global context. But yet that wasn't being marked explicitly. And there was a story of intellectual origins that connects critical race theory with third world approaches to international law, emerging out of similar milieux, similar sets of debates, similar sets of critical tools and apparatuses, but not necessarily then entering into one another's conversations. So both as critical race studies face a critique of being excessively centered on the United States and therefore parochial in some respects, Tzouvala faced a critique of not adequately centering race as an analytic lens. And so there was an effort that I was involved in trying to create a platform to bring these conversations back into overlap with one another that has been incredibly rich and very successful. So I would draw your attention to a recent issue of the Journal of International Economic Law that Ntina Tzouvala co-edited with James Scotty that looks specifically at racial capitalism as an example of the ways in which bringing these research agendas together has been incredibly rich. But there's a lot more, and that special issue gives you a sense of what are the urgent issues when you make race and empire together, a shared analytic lens in thinking about international law, what is then foregrounded and what comes to the surface in the kinds of analysis that we're providing. So to begin with, to understand colonial processes of dispossession and transformation as both racialized and mediated by international law argumentation is an incredibly important critical move that gets undertaken. And then the next question when you center dispossession as part of that story is, how does this then connect to ideas of political economy? So what's missing maybe in our title in some ways when we say race, empire, and international law is an explicit marking of the ways in which this operates through a global political economy, which I think is the reason that it's so exciting for us to be here today in this particular panel thinking about this. Now, I don't myself work specifically on international economic law, although there are intersections with some of what I do around questions of reparation, questions of sovereign debt, questions of sanctions, that all of which, of course, implicate global political economy. But the exciting set of moves that I think are afoot in our discipline in thinking in international law in conjunction and taking race and empire together is the fact that it brings to the fore international economic law to the extent that it does. And so again, this is indicated by the fact that the special issue I mentioned a moment ago is in the Journal of International Economic Law. It is an account that introduces or invites back into the story of Tzouvala and the story of CRS, explicitly marks their frames of thinking about both race and empire. And this, I think, is the productive research agenda that sets a path for us to move forward with, in which we understand both international law and race as features of a capitalist mode of production in the sense of dispossession and exploitation. So what would it look like to then take this kind of an analytic frame and ask the question again of what are the most urgent issues that emerge in the international arena? We end up finding ourselves on a very different story as an example of how to understand climate crisis, which connects climate justice to questions both of historical, of course, exploitation, but the racialized character of that historical exploitation, and then connecting it to latter-day or contemporary claims around reparations, which I think is, very different, let's just put it that way, than what international environmental law might have looked like just a decade ago in most law schools, that even those law schools that had robust critical race traditions within the House, and also folks who are thinking self-consciously about international law from the perspective of the global South. It also connects to migration in a very different way that I think is, very promising. I mean, today, what we have is, as many of you know, international refugee law and international human rights law as the two sort of frameworks through which we can even think about migration. Their inadequacies are legion, but to understand how we could try to now penetrate those, how it has come to be that these are the international law frameworks that we have to work with, and how they're disconnected from the long afterlives and history of colonialism, slavery, exploitation, expropriation, and now climate, gives us a very different lens to try to intervene and think in new ways about how to push doctrine forward, and do so across an array of different disciplinary areas in international law. So we don't necessarily think of, for example, we didn't used to think of climate as a migration topic, and people who are working in international environment weren't necessarily doing so in a way that overlapped or intersected with migration. And now I think that's changed dramatically, and we have new tools, and I think some of that's going to come up in a conversation for thinking creatively across these disciplinary boundaries in international law by adopting the framework that I began by foregrounding. Similarly, we have new and I think very interesting and exciting work in the area of laws of war and international humanitarian law. Here we're closer to things that are actually within my own research agenda, and the Ukraine conversation. I just returned, from the American Society of International Law's conference, which is happening right now, the annual meeting in DC. And when you bring these sets of questions before, when empire and ways of like you're asking questions and you're taking moreover, an explicitly Marxist frame in addressing the ways in which aggression is currently being interrogated in the international arena, where suddenly the architects of aggression just a decade earlier are the principal sort of patrons of a new movement to create special tribunals to try the crime of aggression. You're able to ask questions very differently than conventional international law does, which again bring together a whole host of different perspectives. So for example, that ask, what is the nature of empire today that explains why the crime of aggression in Ukraine can be distinguished from its instantiation in the case of Iraq, or in the case of any number of unauthorized military interventions that the United States prosecuted over the course of the last 2 decades. And I will leave it to Ntina to make explicit the answers that one might get by posing the question in this way. So I'm just gonna, but they're remarkable, and she's the author of at least one instance of that at a recent symposium, the last piece of which just got published, I think, 2 days ago. So I will leave her to describe the answers that she provides. But again, it underscores the ways in which bringing these two analytic lenses together and doing so in a way that also really emphasizes political economy has been transformative for the directions that at least critical international law scholarship is moving. And then the last piece that I want to talk to, which returns us to both international economic law and just asks about future directions for research agendas, is around sanctions, reparations, and thinking critically about the world that we are now beginning to confront. So on the one hand, there are lacuna in questions that we have engaged with, at least from a Tzouvala perspective, that are surprising. So one thing that came out of the conversations around bringing CRT and Tzouvala back together were, what are the pieces of the research agenda that existed in, let's say, Tzouvala 1 in the immediate aftermath of decolonization that have fallen away. So one piece of it was incomplete decolonization. And so Palestine has come back into the fore, and there are a whole host of new projects that are moving forward to center particularly a racial analysis of how the international expropriation of Palestinians and their denial of self-determination has worked its way through as an imperial project in international law. Another set of questions, apart from incomplete decolonization, has been hegemonic competition. So what does it look like, and how do we think critically about a world in which you have multipolarity, pluralism? This was, of course, the condition of the Cold War, but in the aftermath of the post-Cold War period, so much of the work was around a kind of single hegemonic project and really thinking exclusively through the lens of America as the seat of empire, that it has in some ways denuded the apparatus we have available for now thinking again of what does it look like when we see hegemonic competition. So that's a whole other set of research agendas, again, that people are beginning, and I include myself amongst those people, are beginning to try to craft a new forward-looking agenda, particularly one that asks, how can we disaggregate our understanding of something like the third world, deterritorialize that concept in order to explode the ways in which we see empire operating and power sort of circulating through a sort of, well, to borrow B.S. Cheney's language for a moment, a transnational capital class, such that we can make sense of both a third world solidaristic position and an understanding of, for example, China or India or Brazil as rising hegemons in a competitive and multipolar context. And then lastly, so if I said, incomplete decolonization is one track, hegemonic was another track, then the last one is the question of sanctions and the actual use of economic coercion explicitly in the international system as a form of warfare, essentially. And why is it that we've excluded the economic from our understanding of coercion? Because, of course, there was an imperial project to exclude it literally at an early moment in treaty drafting in the wake of the creation of the current public international legal order that we are in. But returning to the topic of sanctions, which you would think would be an absolutely central plank of third world approaches to international law, Marxist critiques of international law, and given the racialized impact of the global picture of sanctions, Russia notwithstanding for the moment, you would think would be central, and yet actually has been another gap in. So economic coercion was an incredibly important part of the story of in the decolonial moment of what a third world approach to international law would be, but fell out, like explicit economic coercion fell out from research agendas in a way that needs to be recovered. So those are 3 paths forward that I see that emerge out of the adoption of the particular analytic lens of this that this panel is engaging. And now I guess I can't remember what our order is, so I want to turn over to my wonderful colleagues who are going to describe ways that their own research is actually advancing these agendas that I just described.
Thank you, Elsa. Generated, Zohra.
All right, well, thank you for laying the groundwork, and just wonderful to be here to be gathered and have this conversation. And I'm going to be talking about the war on terror and how empire is absolutely necessary for us to understand the US activities during the war on terror. So writing 2005, one of the founders of Yale, Anthony Angie, helped us see that the United States, for its justifications to wage war in Iraq and Afghanistan, relied on distinctions between rogue and civilized states, and those rehashed older arguments around the colonial encounter. Since then, the United States strategy in the war on terror has shifted, no longer relies on state failure to justify its activities, but instead on state capacity to consent. And in that shift, sovereign debt has become a really critical instrument for extraterritorial rule and the use of force. And I'm going to use Pakistan as a case study because it's been the United States' most important partner in the war on terror. And what you see over the past 20 years is that the United States has used its position at the IMF to encourage lending decisions that would help guarantee Pakistan's cooperation in the war on terror. And you can see this in sort of three very stark anecdotes, but there are many different ways one can illustrate these dynamics. And of course, these dynamics are in no way unique to Pakistan. So on the eve of 9/11, Pakistan is under sanctions for nuclear testing. It's also on the brink of economic collapse. Analysts are sounding the alarm bell that the debt has reached unsustainable proportions. On the other side of 9/11, once Pakistan has pledged to assist the United States in its war efforts next door in Afghanistan, the United States helps Pakistan get a new lending arrangement from the IMF, and the Paris Club forgives and reschedules $12.5 billion in debt, which is about 10% of Pakistan's GDP. 7 years later, the United States is preparing for a surge in Afghanistan, and of course needs Pakistan and its land and its roads to be able to transport everything. Pakistan is also in the midst of a very contested negotiation with the IMF over a suspended lending arrangement. In a highly unusual move, General Petraeus goes to the IMF on Pakistan's behalf to lobby for this new tranche of funding to be released, and surely enough it is. And then we can look at recently as last year when Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan falls in a vote of no confidence, coincidentally after his relations with the IMF and the domestic military had soured. The caretaker government that steps in similarly balks at implementing austerity measures that are required by the IMF. And stepping into the fissure, Pakistan's top military general goes to the State Department to ask the State Department to put pressure on the IMF to release a new tranche of funding, which inevitably does. So what these three anecdotes help us see is that sort of at a basic level, sovereign credit is the grease for military cooperation. But it's not simply that these are inducements. What we can see over a longer period of time, if we will go back to the 1980s, is that the United States has helped cultivate Pakistan's dependency on credit. The carrot, so to speak, has become so irresistible that it's become a stick. And so we can go back to 1988 when Pakistan started its very long and protracted and continuous involvement with the IMF. And despite the fact that the loans have underperformed, Pakistan has not met the harsh conditions for structural adjustment. The loans have continued to be dispersed. And the most reliable outcome has not been growth or macroeconomic stabilization as the IMF promises, but increased inequality and an increased debt load. Now, the risks have been socialized, the benefits have been privatized, and in particular, an elite within Pakistan has been able to shield its assets from taxation, and it's precisely that elite that has supported Pakistan's military, which then has offered the most accommodations and the most access to the United States. So where can we sort of attribute the problem? Well, the IMF's governance is critically at fault here. First of all, to build up what Asli mentioned about the absence of reparations, the IMF intervenes on post-colonial states in the absence of any reparations after decolonization and treats these balance of payments crises with supposed to solve as the fault of improper fiscal discipline, as opposed to sort of chronic systemic issues in the hierarchy of currencies that govern all countries of the world. And then the IMF is an institution that self-governs, has been historically immune from accountability despite sort of incontrovertible evidence that its loan conditions do not deliver growth. The United States plays an outsized role at the IMF, and across context, we know that the United States has used that position to encourage lending decisions, not for economic reasons, but for its own geopolitical interests. And then just the fact that the loan conditions have a very stark distributional consequences of no legal concern to the IMF. So this debt trap that has been cultivated by domestic, local actors and international and the United States has then been leveraged by the United States most recently to be able to wage its foreign terror. So what kind of empire then can we say emerges from this, and what are the stakes or legal stakes for this sort of description? So maybe our idea of empire sort of revolves around empires proudly declaring themselves as such, planting a flag into the land. But here, of course, there's a different imperial strategy, and we have to look no further than practices of indirect rule to know that a critical piece of imperial strategy is to obfuscate the vectors of accountability. And so scholar Mabiha Tahir encourages us to look at empires being distributed across a range of fields. And if it is distributed, then that means that our task is to trace those diffuse tentacles. And here we see that underlying a relationship of military cooperation are debtor-creditor relationships, which are not actually unique to the United States and Pakistan. As Pakistan has moved away from its reliance on the United States, it has now moved to China for its primary financier at the same time as military ties have intensified. So one kind of framework that might be helpful to us as legal scholars might be Kwame Nkrumah's term or theory of neocolonialism, precisely because he draws our attention to the fiction of legal formalist sovereignty that is bifurcated from economic sovereignty, and that formal legal independence is completely compatible with economic compulsion. We then should look at the ways in which forms of domination can pierce and dominate despite sovereignty. Indeed, it's precisely because Pakistan is a sovereign state that it finds itself in this debt trap. And so thus, we must, I think, sort of be able to parse through between self-determination and sovereignty as two distinct legal concepts. And I think there's also, so this case study also sort of suggests that there's many different ways militarism, debt, and empire can relate to each other. We think of sort of the Marxist canon, Lenin in imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, shows that it's the bankers and their clients that push towards imperial expansion, right? Profit is the motivation. Rosa Luxemburg, however, helps us see that debt has a destabilizing impact, for example, in Egypt, which then creates the conditions for foreign domination. Now, in the war on terror, banks and their clients are not the protagonists, the most visible protagonists that I see. So instead, I think we have to look to someone like Ruth Wilson Gilmore's account in Golden Gulag, who tells us to look away from the profit motive and instead to understand the application of state violence as a solution for a state in crisis. And that then requires us to pay attention to the domestic politics of states in the periphery. So in Pakistan, its participation in the war on terror is inextricably linked to the crisis of legitimacy facing the then military dictatorship and its debt crisis. And thus, in turn, it suggests that these sort of Pakistan's struggles against the IMF in the United States are inextricably bound with domestic struggles within Pakistan against the military, against racist repression of regional autonomy movements, where the US bombs tend to land, and against the IMF. And so thus, in turn, suggests that scholarship and resistance thus must also be both intersectional and transnational to be able to bridge the multiple ways in which the threats to self-determination at an internal and external level are interlocked.
Thank you so much, Zohra. Now I have to hand it over to Andy.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be with this incredible group of scholars. I have to give the disclaimer that I'm not an international scholar. So I'm kind of the cuckoo's egg, is that the term that people use, the one who's not like the others on this panel. I wanted to use my time to reflect as a teacher of environmental justice and critical race theory and related fields. What might it look like to bring race, empire, and transnational or international law into the conversation? And some of the animating questions might be then, what kinds of projects become visible when we bring race and empire into the conversation? How do race and empire trouble the idea of international law? And where does LPE scholarship need to go in order to properly reckon with race and empire? So a couple of case studies for reflection that relate to areas that I've taught. This Thursday, a few days ago, after decades of pressure from indigenous people around the world, the Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And US law students usually get exposed to the doctrine, if at all, in their 1L property classes when we read Johnson versus McIntosh, the 1823 Supreme Court decision written by Chief Justice John Marshall, the first case in the so-called Marshall Trilogy on the rights of Indian peoples in the United States. And Marshall famously explains that in the period of European colonization, the European powers needed some kind of principle in order to settle disputes among themselves for control of new territories. And that principle became the idea that discovery gives title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. Marshall explains that while the different nations of Europe respected the rights of the natives as occupants, they asserted the ultimate dominion to be in themselves and claimed an exercise as a consequence of this ultimate dominion of power to grant the soil while yet in possession of the natives. These grants have been understood by all to convey a title to the grantees subject only to the Indian right of occupancy. And Marshall goes on to explain how England fully obeyed this principle. In 1496, the monarch granted a commission to the cabinets to discover countries then unknown to Christian people and to take possession of them in the name of the King of England. 2 years afterwards, Cabot proceeded on this voyage and discovered the continent of North America, along which he sailed as far south as Virginia. And Marshall says, to this discovery, the English traced their title. So how come the millions of indigenous people living in the lands of North America when it was discovered are unable to hold legal title to them, but only are able to hold a right of occupancy, which is feasible by conquest or contract? Marshall is admirably clear in his opinion that the doctrine of discovery is about political economy, and more to the point about the law's obedience to political and economic power. So he says, quote, we will not enter into controversy whether agriculturalists, merchants, and manufacturers have a right on abstract principles to expel hunters from the territory they possess or to contract their limits. Conquest gives a title which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. So the doctrine of discovery, as we know, is not unique to the courts of the United States. Some version of it is central to the colonization of Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Canada, and probably more countries as well. And the importance of the doctrine is not just that it justified European wars of extermination against indigenous people in all those places. It's not just that it set the stage for what Marx calls primitive accumulation, building wealth through violent dispossession and extraction. It's also that present-day international law is built on this foundation of the law of nations, which began by representing non-Christians as not entitled to basic legal rights. Over time, the line between Christian and non-Christian became a line drawn between people who were civilized and those who were savages. But although the justifications changed, the outcome was always the same. The protection of international law were only for those people who belonged to the so-called family of nations. And indigenous leaders through the years have argued that these past conquests are not historical curiosities. They are continuing acts of domination. So there's a live controversy for indigenous folks about the legitimacy of this project. The doctrine of discovery shows the rootedness of contemporary international law in an irrevocable exclusion that represents some collectivities as nations and others only as peoples, which is kind of the awkward designation given today to international in international law to indigenous peoples. So what might it mean to bring race, empire, and international law into questions around critical race theory? There's been a long and somewhat awkward divide between critical race theory and indigenous studies or American Indian law. And that divide is in part because of the very real risk that to associate too closely with peoples of color, racialized minorities in the United States, might just encourage the trend of the US Supreme Court to designate Indian law and Indian sovereignty as merely a matter of racial preference. So there's been this deliberate attempt to stay away from questions of race on the part of indigenous folks out of the fear that the entire edifice of Indian law might be reduced by the Supreme Court into questions of racial preference and thus military evil. On the critical race side, I think the distance from indigeneity has meant in part a focus on anti-discrimination law and equality law within the nation state as the primary driver, the primary path for liberation. That effaces or erases a long history of Black international political economic activism, from the Black Panther Party's calls for self-determination on the world stage to engagement by liberation groups with the Communist Party International, the solidarity initiatives with countries of the global South, to the movement to secede from the United States and establish the Black nation, New Africa, in the former slave states. So reframing non-indigenous minority struggles through the lens of empire may push back against this tendency to treat racial solidarity as pure identity politics and or equality within a nation state, the given nation state, and push us toward a more transnational understanding of race and racial domination and racial solidarity and Black liberation and other forms of liberation. So that's one reflection. My second reflection comes from my years teaching environmental justice and its overlapping fields, climate justice, and more recently, just transition. And these fields, in the absence of what has become this LPE approach to scholarship and teaching, these fields get kind of left in a gap between legal disciplines, analytical methods, and student constituencies. So in terms of the legal disciplinary divides, environmental justice usually gets slotted into the environmental law curriculum. And that's a really difficult fit because EJ conceptually is at odds with many of the founding assumptions of environmental law, including the technocratic framing of relevant knowledge. So the reliance of conventional environmental law and scientific, legal, and economic expertise over the lived experience of frontline communities, along with the idea that participation by those frontline communities means manufacturing consent to technocratic governance through practices like notice and comment rulemaking. Another assumption that EJ pushes against is the reliance on the administrative state, often in cooperation with industry, as in the preference for market-based governance over command and control regulation. Another assumption is the framing of environmental concerns as secondary to economic production, as in the absence of a precautionary principle for industrial companies. And finally, the lack of interest in the role of poverty, economic exploitation, finance capital, and corporate power in shaping environmental protection or the lack thereof. All of these are absences in the traditional or conventional environmental curriculum, but are central questions to environmental justice. But environmental justice also doesn't fit any better within the civil rights curriculum, eventually conceived. So again, courses in anti-discrimination law don't typically pay attention to environmental justice concerns, quite understandably, because attempts to mobilize anti-discrimination law for racialized frontline communities have been consistently rejected in courts. The production of disparate environmental burdens is also closely tied to the production and maintenance of poverty. Luke Cole, who is one of the pioneers of EJ lawyering, initially thought of the field as environmental poverty law. But as we know, there are no robust legal protections for poor people in the US. Even more than race law, poverty law in the US is purely, as Julie Nice has written, about managing the poor, not interested in analyzing poverty as a phenomenon, let alone trying to seriously eradicate it. So those are some of the awkward disciplinary divides that leave environmental justice teaching and research kind of in this vacuum. There are also analytical divides that make the subject of environmental justice and climate justice and just transition difficult to get into. EJ is typically introduced to students as a US movement and taught to students within national administrative law frameworks. But obviously, particularly in this moment of climate crisis, you can see that the problems and the solutions are often transnational, meaning that international environmental law, international trade law, international human rights law are all relevant to environmental justice. And the fact that the movement frames social justice, economic justice, and ecological resilience as intertwined tends to make it invisible to the conventional logic of contemporary law, under which the state, the market, and society are all treated as these separate spheres that have their own logics and own ways of working. All of this, I think, contributes to constituency divide. Everybody that I know who has taught environmental justice has been frustrated by the fact that students of color don't take the course, assuming that it's a white thing. And this lack of interest even shows up in movement spaces, despite the fact that it was people of color such as Bob Bullard and the participants in the 1989 People of Color National Summit who shaped the field in the United States, and that nations in the global South conventionally racialized as people of color by elites in the global North are the leaders in conceptualizing solutions to these reparations. So that kind of distancing, like, that's not really for me, is in part a legacy of the divides and lacunae that I've described, and also a legacy in part of the US history of environmental movement, which was dominated for decades by a deeply racialized wilderness conservation ethic. So what might happen if we brought race and empire into the EJ space in teaching and in research? One thing that might happen would be a transformation of environmental law teaching and research, more transnational conversations about economic production and trade and legacies of empire, more self-consciousness about the technocracy, democracy, and administrative states, more discussion about the effects of national economic productivity discourses or environmental discourses. Another thing that might happen would be a better recognition of the connective tissue between natural resources law, which is the law of economic and ecological extraction, and environmental law, which is law of protecting what's left after the extraction. So I want to end just by throwing some questions on the table that we might want to engage in the conversation. And that's to say that bringing race and empire into the conversation may be a challenge for the LPE as well. So can LPE successfully integrate the research programs of CRT and feminist legal theory, or will the movement perform a racialized and gender fragmentation? And this shows up as a familiar race versus class problem. As we bring finance production into the conversation, do we necessarily draw questions of social reproduction and hierarchy? I think those tensions are very much visible in how we're trying to rethink LPE. A related question has to do with method. Political economy is sometimes taken to mean embracing a divide between the material and the cultural discursive modes of inquiry. And so, as Jonathan was talking about yesterday, as we turn back to Marx, we have to turn our backs and Foucault. That's one way that. And then finally, to what extent will LPE as an academic movement be self-reflective and critical of the political economy of academia? One place this question manifests is through the question of connections with movement lawyering and law and order. To what extent is this a movement that is about having better research programs and interesting ideas, but not necessarily with traction in terms of action on the ground? Do we assume that if we write good articles that place well, the world will change? Do we want to change the world? Or do we just want to have better conversation from ours? I think we haven't really answered that question. And I'm also thinking about the movement to decolonize the university, which is coming from the humanities. If race and empire are epistemological projects, then we have to be self-conscious about what we think knowledge is and where it comes from. Is there anything in this literature and framework for lawyers to pay attention to? Or is that a manifestation that really is quite separate and not related to what it is that we do? So I'll throw those questions out and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Angela. Now, last but not least, Ntina.
Thank you very much. I'm very lucky to be last because I think I can be a magpie and pick up different things that have been raised. And this is what I'm going to do. Actually, I'm going to try to take my cues from Angela's ideas of how we bring things together. Zohra's point about finance and money as part of the conversation, especially because, and maybe in this room it will feel very strange, I would say international lawyers have been relatively oblivious, including critical and including Marxist international lawyers have been relatively oblivious to questions of money and finance and how they structure imperialism, and also Asla's final challenge to think seriously about the kind of like fizzled out question of economic coercion in international law. And the reason I want to talk also about this in this room is that LP obviously has brought into on the table questions of money as a means of democratic governance and also as a means of redistribution, perhaps. And there is a lot of promise in that discussion, but when the discussion obviously takes place in the United States of America, where you're not talking about money in general, you're talking about the US dollar in particular, right? And once you zoom out internationally, US dollar is not a promise, it's a threat. And I'm trying to currently think about what sort of a threat it is, and I'm currently trying to think about a draft of a draft of a draft about the ways in which the predominance of the dollar as a global currency, and every time I say global, I want you to think imperial, enables the United States of America to basically, if not in doctrine, at least in practice, almost unilaterally set out the rules in very important fields of law. Zohra was great at showing us in practice how you can move lending cogs. I am trying to think about state immunity, and especially state immunity in the context of sanctions. So as you know, the formal invasion of Ukraine over a year ago triggered what many was treating until that moment as pretty much unthinkable, which is the freezing of the assets of central banks held, of Russian central banks. Of course, there are precedents to that, but the amount of money was simply unprecedented. And apart from the question of sanctions and such, this also poses the question of state immunity. State immunity, basically sovereign state immunity in international law, apologies for explaining something basic, means that sovereign governments, when acting as states, and that's a very interesting question in its own right, what on earth that international law seems to have imported a theory of the state, and we just treat us as normal. They cannot be subject to the jurisdiction of courts. Put a question mark here, an asterisk, because I think there is contestation here, or to the execution of court decisions, again, asterisk, of another sovereign state. The justification of that is a pretty traditional international law justification that sovereign cannot judge sovereign. There is sovereign equality in international law, therefore sovereign states cannot be subjected to the courts, asterisk, of another state. And it was pretty much a given that central bank assets held overseas were covered by this immunity, with certain debates around the edges, well, depending if your Qatar is not around the edges, about sovereign wealth funds, right? If funds used for investment purposes are actually covered. That is controversial, but the basic thing was not controversial. Everyone treated it as a given. The US and the EU have suddenly broken this by freezing extensive assets. This didn't happen with Russia. It also happened, is still happening with Afghanistan, with Iran, with Venezuela, etc. So what is happening in this space? And I think that's really, really worrisome, is obviously the United States is advancing a couple of insane arguments about, it's the only word I have, about state immunity when it comes to central bank assets. The first argument that started with Venezuela and is now happening with Afghanistan is that if the United States acknowledges me as the government of Afghanistan, and me is not an exaggeration, I'm going to explain, they can hand me over the central bank assets, and this doesn't even engage immunity. State immunity is not violated at all because I'm the government. Tzouvala is the government of Afghanistan, and therefore giving me the assets it does not engage the rule at all. This sounds like a bit facetious. Currently, the US has set up the people of Afghanistan, something like that, which is a body based in Switzerland that includes a number of Swiss and US national. There is also like one Afghan person on the board, and they're saying for the purposes of humanitarian relief, we assume that these people are acting on behalf of Afghan people. They're not saying it's the government, because this random like lady in Switzerland is not right saying she's the government of Afghanistan, but they're saying for the purposes of humanitarian relief, we are recognizing them as representatives of the interests of Afghan people. $3.5 billion of Afghan central bank assets have been handed to them to be distributed. And the argument, both in practice and in scholarship, is that this doesn't engage the rule of state immunity at all. You can understand what this means for like global South sovereignty, right? That we can start first, cutting it down into different pieces and recognizing as representatives whoever we like. Basically, I cannot say how any idea of international legal obligation can survive this argument, right? Because I can also start signing treaties with Zohra, recognizing her as the government of Pakistan. I can't understand how any idea of legal obligation can survive this. I'm presenting this as insane because it is. But at a certain level, and that's my argument, it doesn't matter. The US can say pretty much anything when it comes to state immunity. Because the US, because of the power of the dollar, in international legal making when it comes to state immunity, I think also when it comes to a couple of other things, a unique lawmaking position. And this is where I think the insights both from Tzouvala and from Marxism are really useful. What Tzouvala did was to bring to the forefront basically the colonial encounter, the encounter between colonizer and colonized, or subsequently between center and periphery, as constitutive of international legal concepts and doctrines. One, I think, very crucial addition / correction to that aspect of Tzouvala has come from Marxist international lawyer Robert Knox. What Rob has said was, this is absolutely true. The aspect of imperialism that Tzouvala initially didn't pay much attention to was inter-imperialist competition, right? That within the imperialist game, if you don't only have colonized and colonizing, you have different colonial powers competing for influence, power, profit accumulation, etc. And his argument is to understand international law, we don't need to understand the relationship between the United States and Afghanistan or the United States and Venezuela. We also need to understand the relationship between the competition between the United States and China in, let's say, Southeast Asia. And his argument is that historically, especially the US, has been trying to formulate arguments in such a way that they're available to the US and its allies, but not available to its imperial rivals, right? We can do humanitarian intervention because we're good people and we represent universal values. Russia cannot do humanitarian intervention in Ukraine because they're bad people and they're lying, unlike us, that we never lie. So, obviously there is a problem with that, right? And Ukraine is a good example, which is once the argument is out, actually you can never guarantee that it will not be used by your imperial rivals. You can try to safeguard it argumentatively and institutionally, but at least the nominal reciprocity and the nominal universalism of international law makes the argument available to anyone who can competently put it forward or anyone who's shameless enough to put it forward. This limitation, so this is, I think, a limitation, in a sense, a perverse limitation to imperial power in international law, right? Because you always have to have at the back of your mind, am I okay in the unlikely event that China or Russia uses this argument, either against me or against my allies in the region? I argue that especially in terms of state immunity, this imperial rivalry backstop simply is not there because there is no reciprocity when it comes to currencies and reserves in international law, right? The US does not have to worry that one day China is going to block the huge reserves that the US holds in China, because that's simply not the case. So I'm saying that what is particularly worrisome in this situation is you have a situation in which, and I'm saying the US, in reality, I mean New York, right? It's not Kansas that is deciding on that. You have a situation in which New York courts have de facto, if not de jure, capacity of unilaterally determining the law when it comes to state immunity. You can say that both the sheer number of cases and the amount of money decided in terms of state immunity disputes, decided in front of New York courts, far surpass any other jurisdiction, both national and of course regional, anywhere else in the world, right? If you are a legal realist minded and you want to make prophecies about what the laws of state immunity are, they are simply predictions at the limit of what New York courts are going to say and nothing more pretentious. So we have a situation. And there is a number of other arguments the US is putting forward. I gave you the crazier one, but the other argument, of course, is remember the asterisk I asked you to put next to courts. Historically, sovereign immunity had been framed in terms of courts. What the US and the EU and Japan have done, again, is to say, well, actually, Russia's assets and Venezuela's assets and Iran's assets were actually frozen through executive action. And we think that executive action is actually not covered by sovereign state immunity. We can not seize for the time being, or we can freeze assets of central banks through executive action. And again, that doesn't even engage state immunity rules. This is it feels counterintuitive for a number of reasons. It is, I think it's wrong, but it's still slightly, interestingly, more plausible because interestingly enough, both the international treaties and the relevant statutes do mention courts. There is an interesting discussion to be made there if they mention courts because they didn't ever think that anyone was going to use executive action, or of course you could say, well, what they really mean is judicial function rather than courts as a formal branch of government. So there is interesting arguments to be made there, but of course, as I said again, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter because the position of the US yields disproportionate influence on that regard. Interestingly, in the multi-imperial competition story there hasn't been as much protestation as you would think on that specific point. I'm wondering if like China and Russia are hedging their bets a little bit there, seeing perhaps an option of transferring more and more functions to the executive and then saying, well, actually now it's not covered, how lovely. So that could be there. I'm fully speculating here because I think that the silence is quite perplexing, at least to me. But my point is, there's all these debates happening right now in the space of state immunity, and the US has, both the US state and of course US scholars have disproportionate influence, and that's perhaps the final point I want to make. I'm just thinking in a sense of, as you were saying, Angela, academic-based critique and its relationship with real struggles, because I think it is quite attractive, and it's attractive because it's true to often attribute injustices or power balance within the legal system to disciplinary biases, to problems within the field itself, right? So it's a very common trail argument to say state practice and opinion juries of rich, white, capitalist states in the center is being given within international law disproportionate weight. And this is a problem, right? This is the outcome of disciplinary bias along the races, or along the lines of race and along the lines of imperialism, etc. I think what is missing from this conversation is that very often what we face is not a disciplinary bias that can be fixed through disciplinary reform. It is material power, right? Here, to think that the US has a privileged position is not an idea that I have in my head. It's not an idea that you have in your head, and if only I persuade you to let it go, it will be fixed. It is a material reality in the world, right? So I'm trying to bring in thinking about skewed patterns of lawmaking in international law, not through bias, but through material power. And of course, there is also the limit, right, to everything I have been saying, which you can see again playing out in debates in the United States, in which some actors are agitating for seizing and redistributing of these assets. And the concern is not international law, but there's a very, very real concern that this will trigger a flight from the dollar to the extent that it is possible, right? So I have been talking about US power in this field as if it were unlimited. It is not unlimited, but the limitation is posed by the US's own investment in maintaining the status of the dollar as an imperial currency. And I think in a sense that it is there rather than in international law that the decision about what will happen to Russian assets will be decided. I think on that note, I'm done.
Great. Like a repeat vision from the authorities, the powers that be, to go back and over on our scheduled program. So that means we have about 10 minutes for our Q&A, and then we reserve the full 20 for the audience Q&A after that. That'll take us to 5. So I just want to maybe open up with a question that I've been kind of formulating over the course of all of these fascinating interventions, and something that I've been seeing is just the beginning of Asli's comments, the extent to which it seems like the core project, or not, it's not a core project, but in fact, if you were to rank it in order of importance, the specific body of international law, or the area of international law that is most amenable and perhaps has the greatest, to borrow a phrase from the other side, is the most efficient sort of allocation of effort is international economic law. And it seems to run across the whole sort of gamut, just from a very programmatic, a very large survey that Asli was doing through what Zohra is doing in her work in Pakistan relations, debt relations, and credit, and sovereign debt diplomacy, and then through what Angela was talking about with respect to environmental law and environmental justice being susceptible to this kind of larger view that would enrich its application both here, but then world, and then running through all of what you just said. That's one question. Is there a way to think of that bringing international economic law as maybe the thing that to get the most immediate payoff is maybe the most not to say important, but should be a very strong area of focus.
Yeah, maybe I'll start by just saying that one question no one has to ask is what is the form that empire takes at different times, right? Because it's also a shape-shifting sort of set of structural relationships. And I think the thing I'm pointing to is that the contemporary imperial order, which has been premised for a very long time on direct U.S. hegemony, unilaterally constrained in the way that Ntina described, and now possibly constrained to some extent, I think, by imperial rivalry that does need to explore to what extent it's like from the United States problem. Now, is it possible as a strategy, and what might be triggered by some of the things that are going on around, excuse me, not just Russian assets, but things like, Argentina's debt and the ways in which the Southern District of New York how resources will be allocated and to whom, whether or not there's going to be flight. But that the nature of the imperial order is one that has been entirely, I think, reduced in some ways to international economic subordination and domination. So that's part of the story that's being told here. It's not, there are of course other material expressions that including military bases, 100 or more across the globe, including then pointed, acute exercises of military force that have in some ways dominated the agenda when we step back and as a public matter talk about empire, in part because empire used to be, colonialism used to be a matter of direct on the ground boots. And so we have a way of imagining the world in which not having boots on the ground is evidence of progress of some kind. That is the form that decolonization has taken. But of course, that is a category. But it does raise a set of other questions, which is if that's the premier form that empire takes today, especially in its US articulation, is through both economic domination and economic coercion, does that mean that the locus of the battle, the way that we have to mobilize also has to be organized around international economic law? And there I'm less sure, and I'd be interested in engaging our colleagues, because of course the impact on the ground and the movement actor, how to conceive of a movement that is emancipatory or that is committed to resisting domination, where its attention should be addressed, could be defined in lots of different ways. For example, border practices, the actual territorial integration of the ways in which that international imperial order has articulated the relationship of power to territory might still be the place that at least some version of emancipation has to be focused. And so what do we think about in the labor movement? What do we think about migration? How do we understand climate justice? May actually not travel exclusively or even primarily through engagements with international economic doctrine law, as an example. Having said that, of course, it's also not independent. So I think that, where Ntina left off is what would it even look like if in fact we have an international order in which the United States is unilaterally able to be the author of the rules in a vast array of domains that are connected to finance and investment, and its courts have become world courts for these purposes, then how would we begin to articulate a resistance, and is it enough, is it an error to imagine that, contesting the disproportionate role in international law formation of the global north as a disciplinary matter is going to yield anything. So is this a distortion? But actually, what are they trying to point to? And what is Hoyle trying to point to in suggesting that we have to pay attention to, for example, the global south in international rule formation and not accept state practice on the part of the global north states as indicative of an actual set of rules that the rest of the world consents to? What they're pointing to is we are living this material reality, but what are the levers that are left available to us to try to influence or shift norm formation in that world? And so the other thing that's finally done in an attempt to be connected, in my mind, at the global level, it's harder to think about movement lawyering and how you connect movement lawyering, right? It's not easy to say, I have an analysis of international empire and I'm going to come up with a strategy of how that's going to connect to neighborhood coalition formation. But there have been these strategies, and there are these what I would describe as meta level strategies to take over from inside various international institutional formations and contest the domination of the global north in those formations. And you can see that strategy succeeding every time the US withdraws from a particular multilateral entity, denounces it as a dictator's club or some backwater thing that's no longer relevant, et cetera. We see this in the Human Rights Council very clearly. We see it in the way that the General Assembly has been dismissed as a space of contestation around how to frame Ukraine. So is it crazy to say we can try to activate the sort of conception of formal de jure equality against the backdrop of obvious material inequality in various domains, not necessarily international economic law, because there aren't the levers there. The problem is in the multilateral institutions or formations, right? There is no one state, one vote in the Southern District. There is no one state, one vote even at the IMF, right? So you can't, there are spaces where you can't imagine activating the lever of de jure so-called sovereign equality in the resistance strategy. And there are other places where you can. So maybe some of the focuses for imperial resistance remain outside of international, even though the contestation is about constraining the ways in which empire can continue to use international economic law as the mechanism, the kinds of domination that we want to describe. So just
Oh, I was just gonna add that, kind of building on that, that for maybe one way that the knowledge of international economic law could be useful for struggles, in climate justice struggles, for example, or environmental justice struggles, is not as a path for action, but as an understanding of the framework and therefore a strategic question about, okay, given that this is the reality, how do we move? And it might disabuse folks who might otherwise think, oh, if we just go to an international court or, file this claim in international human rights, that will solve the problem. So it could be just that kind of more modest impact.
So the political education sort of angle, yeah, that's really interesting.
I was gonna make the other thing, which I think that there is an exciting movement around changing the voting shares at the IMF. And in part because, I come at this work through anti-war organizing, and it was practically impossible to get people to pay attention to the US drone wars. And I think that seeing the unexpected sources of leverage that might lie at our field and the IMF is a way to build new coalitions. And in Pakistan, people's services against the United States is not singular, but it's also against the central government. It's also against, progressive immiseration. And so the IMF offers a way to think about all of the various challenges now, climate change, befalling Pakistanis. And so because people are living multi-dimensional lives, not simply about war, but about poverty and about democratic control, I think it's exciting to see some of the proposals that have come from states that are on the front line of climate change, who are now advocating for allocating the voting shares of the IMF according to their degree of impact on the White House. And so reframing some of the issues that Pakistan faces, not simply as a country whose sovereignty is compromised by the United States and military domination, but also as a frontline climate change, reframes the conversation, I think offers a chance for new kinds of coalitions, which I think were not possible otherwise.
And then we will move over to that.
So I'm a Marxist, so for me, like all international law is international economic law.
Same.
But I'm kind of serious about that, like apart from the facetiousness. That doesn't mean that I don't think there is a space for intervention. And your own work, actually, you're being quite humble, but your own work is a very exciting intervention there. But I think there's also a case to be made to like go into the basics, right? Start thinking, I don't know how many of you have thought or have taken a general public international law course, but go week by week and start thinking about how these relations of exploitation, dispossession, and domination have been baked into the doctrine of sources and statehood, the statehood bit is easier, or like state immunity, state immunity, things like that. I think there is a case to be made that there is, I think, the moment of people being receptive, or some people in academia being, and in practice being receptive enough, that there is space to go back to the very, very basics and even show that like what you call international economic law has in a sense the struggles of investment have shaped state responsibility. And we forgot about it because it was really uncomfortable to explain that these supposedly general laws of state responsibility have come for very specific struggles about allocation of risk in investments. That's where it has come from. And then the International Law Commission took out these things and transformed them into these rules of general application. They are not. So I think in a sense, thinking these sort of very fundamental questions, maybe I'm saying that also I have to say because I am a generalist public international lawyer by training, so I have this bias, but I do also think it does feel like a moment where that is possible. Like BSG in the past 5-6 years has been writing this big conceptual pieces on Tzouvala and customary law, Tzouvala and responsibility. And he has been placing that, I agree, it's not the end of the, it's not so important, but like just see some of like the Marxist Tzouvala placing on the American Journal of International Law feels unexpected. So it feels like there is space for this one fundamental interventions.
Yeah, no, and I think it says a lot to the possibilities that's what we're talking about with initial thought as a form of political education, and then setting up, even what's what's possible within the existing institutions despite all the resistance.
Yeah.
It could frame how those things work, even something to carry that. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to the audience for about 20 minutes or so. And
Your name and I'll pass it on.
okay, sure.
There's a fair amount of hands, so.
Yeah.
Feel free to time.
Yeah, so let's see here, after the Yale.
Thanks.
Can you hear? Okay, it's working.
So how many minutes was that sounded?
We got 20 minutes.
20 minutes, so just, yeah, better than brief.
Okay. So my name is Dan, I'm an SGD here. Thanks so much for this panel. I thought it was just phenomenal. In many ways, I'm not a Marxist, but I want to ask one question about US dollar. So, I really love particularly Professor Tzouvala and Professor Ahmed's your stories. I think they're so specific and they really clarify. And it just reminds me that the US dollar didn't become the global hegemonic currency by coincidence, right? Or even just because it's a hegemon, right? England had been monetary hegemon over much of the world for 2.5 generations. This dies down in World War I, the interwar period, there's just constant discourse about trying to get back to a hegemon of some kind, right? This, I think, is, in my opinion, is because empire likes a unified global currency, right? It's easier to control. The real threat is more spread out monetary sovereignty generally, countries borrowing their own currency. Bretton Woods happens and they deliberately put the US in that role, right, by design, in a treaty. Bretton Woods breaks down in 71, but the US's role doesn't, right, it even amps up. So this was very much by design, it was a deliberate move. And the real threat, I think, to it, long term, not the immediate threat, but like, in fact, might not even be realistic, but the deeper threat isn't just a rising competing hegemon in China, where like Pakistan shifting its foreign denominated debt is probably, and it must be animated by, and it's not a huge amount, right? It's like 4, 5, 6% or something. must be hedging, if this new hegemon takes over, we want to be the last ones on the train, right? It's political, not just economic. So it's not just about credit, it's about whose credit, and why can't you borrow your own credit? And that's because of the anchoring of international trade, the American dollar. And I'm wondering if there's any discourse in this space about moving in that direction. I don't even know what that would look like. I know it's not easy. I know South American legislators are working on this for generations, they're a lot smarter than me. I'm just wondering, in trail and in this discourse, is there a push for more spread out monetary sovereignty and not just how do we hedge with shifting hegemons and maybe reform how the US uses its power over the dollar?
Actually, let me just take that now.
Sure.
So I think of Mona Ali, who's been working a lot on this, and whether there's a move to shift it, I mean, what I've read of her is that the constraints are so dire that to do that seems almost impossible. So that may not be the move. And again, part of the difficulty is like, or at least for me, is as a lawyer trying to understand the global system of currencies, which is very hard to sort of to grasp. But I would push back on the question of whether it's political economic, like a country like Pakistan is going to China because there's no other sources. And so I think it's still, it's not a hedging as much as a no from the other side. But to your first question, that is not a conversation that policymakers seem to be contemplating. We're moving from crisis to crisis, I think.
Thanks, good to meet you in person. So I don't think there is much discussion within TWAIL in particular, because as I said in the beginning, I think international financial and monetary law has really been a very small part of the discussion. There is a couple of like more junior scholars, kind of Bakchi and Lezon, who are doing stuff on international finance from a TWAIL / Marxism perspective. So it's still, and I think it's quite interesting how little, I think partly because, the mystification. So the hedging thing is an interesting question. I have some thoughts not from monetary and financial law. I have some thoughts from watching the way that small Pacific states have been trying to play the US and China against each other, and to an extent Australia as the minor partner. And it hasn't been going terribly for them, of course, within the terrible constraints that this gives you. But I think, for those who are engaged in policy in practice, I do think there is a case even on that matter to try to hedge a little bit your bets, because also I do think it is worth remembering that, third worldism reached its peak, of course, in a very different political situation, but it wasn't the process of geopolitical competition, right? Suddenly you see Australian politicians not talking to Pacific Islanders like in the mind-blowingly patronizing way that they did the past 30-40 years, and it's because of China. So without any obviously naivety about what it means to be trapped between two imperial currencies, it may be slightly less of a problem than being trapped inside one. I do agree, though, at the end of the day, that you're still working within very extreme constraints. And of course, the question there would be, what came first in the rise of the dollar? Was it the restructuring of global production and circulation that led to the breaking down in 1971, or the other way around? And I don't have an answer, partly because for me it's a relatively new area of thinking. So I think it would be, I don't know, maybe we should resurrect the bank war. I don't know. I don't think it's extremely, or some sort of regional version of it. But it seems to me that the current situation, and especially in the way that the US has been willing to weaponize the dollar in extremely explicit ways, may also, for me, it puts everything on the table in a sense. Thank you.
And can I just add, your point about the earlier history of this imperial transition from the British Empire to the United States? That is, in fact, when we go back to sort of the inter-imperial history aspect that Ntina was talking about, if you were to just survey the work in critical international law and oil and international legal history, which is part of that, so much of it focuses on the world after the transition to the United States as the imperial echelon. And that happens economically far before the formal transition in the post-war world. And so no one's focused on it. And even less people on the operations of inter-imperial rivalry really beginning in the early 19th century in a really significant way. Before that, I say that it's really lonely back there, and I would love to join it. Please, before 1900. And then there you have examples of attempts to break out of the gold standard. South American customs unions shot down, currency unions shot down the same way that Nasur continues to be quite unable to make any progress. The pressure exerted on each country and then on each acting in concert or collectively is too much. And that's a world that does not come from Bretton Woods, it comes considerably further back. So some other interventions here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shanwai. I'm an SJD here. Thank you so much for this for your talks. Can I sort of ask a question about Marxism, because that was sort of one of the original sort of unifying frameworks of all of the talks, and I found that maybe there is a question to be resolved here theoretically before anything else, and this came out as somewhat of a tension between what Professor Ahmed said and what Professor Harris said in some ways, because I think Professor Ahmed's sort of study of Pakistan is showing that there is a way of thinking of the Pakistani elite and many parts of the third world elite as comprador, but that takes the form of historicism. We understand that, you know, sort of capitalism moves in stages and we buy into some sort of Marxist historicism. And obviously Professor Harris, I think, is pushing back against that in some sense, saying that, well, primitive accumulation is the condition of capitalism at all points of time. In other words, it sort of reverses the story of historicism. And so depending on whether we are historicists as Marxists or not, then we have different ways to go in how to fix things, you know, or not fix things, but what is the condition of resistance under those situations. So if you would sort of, it's a very broad general theoretical point, but I wonder what tensions arise then in terms of intervention based on that tension. Thank you.
Can you say more though? Because I'm having hard. Can you say more what you mean by historicism? I'm sorry, I just would appreciate it.
No, sorry, by which I just meant that if history moves through stages, then primitive accumulation has to end for capitalism to sort of take the form that it does, you know, in a historicist reading, which means that comprador elites are born only and after sort of primitive accumulation is out of the question. But do we think of Pakistan's exploitation as a continuation of primitive accumulation or not? And that would really change sort of what we do about that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big debate. I mean, this is like Pakistan study stuff, but you know, there's a big debate within Pakistan around what do we make of the persistence of feudal lords, and is that consistent with capitalism, or are we seeing two different kinds of political economies that exist side to side? And I think that work, you know, while really seminal, comes out obviously really sort of critical sort of theorists on that, posited a vision that feudalism persists. But I think you look kind of at a deeper level, where there may be aspects of feudal domination that might culturally resonate with us, that it's actually that you know, the capitalist transformation of Pakistan has been achieved. This is actually mostly wage labor, that it's and so as primitive accumulation been completed, I don't know if it has been exactly been achieved or overcome rather. I think those are just debates that are happening within Pakistan. I also think that someone might also push back against an idea of a unified Pakistan itself, because of the sort of huge regional differences between Balochistan and the Northwest Frontier provinces, and that Punjab would be categorically distinct. So maybe we have to think about it at a sub-national level and at a regional level, and in which case sort of the Punjabi elite are the ones that are really governing with really no regard for sort of Balochi self-determination or Pathan self-determination. So Yeah, so I'm not sure if I answered the question, except to say that, I think it's complicated and it's regionally, varied, and depends what we think about the aspects of feudalism that persist, for example, in Pakistan.
And on the more theoretical question, I am not a deeply Marxist scholar, but I know that there are debates about this question of primitive accumulation and whether that is a term that fixes or binds us to a kind of rigid historical framework where there's phase one that gets completed, then you move to phase two and phase three. I know there are many scholars who argue that primitive accumulation, quote unquote, is happening all the time. It's not a stage that happened in the past and then it's done with and then we move on. But it is something that is recurrent or in some cases ongoing. So primitive maybe is a word that is misleading to the extent that it fixes us to a temporality that then we're moving in a linear way. So I think that's an ongoing debate among scholars who take a Marxist framework, what primitive accumulation means and when does it happen? How does it happen?
And I jump very quickly. So I was surprised that you're thinking about comparator classes in terms of time and primitive accumulation rather than in terms of space and unevenness, in the sense that my understanding is, at least for many dependency theories, both of the Marxist and of the non-Marxist variation, the existence of these comparator classes in the global south or in semi-periphery don't necessarily have to do with the incompleteness of the capitalist transition, but with their subordinate position within the global capitalist change, right? Which then we can discuss whether it is because they have not fully transition, but when Fanon talks and warns us against the rise of global south intermediaries, he doesn't position it within the incompleteness of the transition. He positions it within the incompleteness of decolonization, right? And that is what will actually maintain and actually bloat these classes. So I'm dodging a bit the question. I know I'm dodging it a little bit, but in a sense, I'm dodging it because I think I'm not really sure if thinking this on the register of primitive accumulation is the only or the most obvious way of thinking about it, but maybe I have missed something in your chain of thinking.
So I'm just going to jump into another possible gloss, which is that in thinking about toil and how it's understanding empire as a form of capitalist mode of production, I think that this idea of primitive accumulation gets transmogrified into a different idea that is essentially versions of capitalism that are parasitic on and dependent upon exploitation, violent dispossession, and extraction. And that is an ongoing characteristic. So if I said earlier that empire is a shape-shifting concept that it defines different kinds of relationships over time and hence encompasses colonial and neocolonial, the neocolonial form of the critique of that toil offers of thinking about empire as a capitalist mode of production continues to build on an idea that capital is being accumulated through these processes, which I think maybe a formal Marxist might describe as accumulation. So in other words, that it's this violent, extractive, dispossessive, exploitative mode of extraction of capital from, and then this connects to Ntina's point of territorializing or deterritorializing, whatever I like it, across space. So the relationship between the global south and the global north is defined in those terms, where one remains the site of that kind of extractive relationship and the other remains the place to which the extraction travels. But the different actors within those different spaces may themselves be capitalist or subaltern, right? Both within Pakistan, let's say, or both within any part of the global south and any part of the global north. This is the way that Chuni now marries with Marxism to toil, as I understand it. And so really the theoretical terms, it's neither nor, essentially, in the way that we pose the question, because we pose the question as if they were sort of divergent accounts, and instead you have a kind of integrated toil move that suggests that it's not a stage of capitalism, or rather that primitive accumulation needs to be reinterpreted through understanding empires have this mode of production, and moreover, and returning to our original theme, where race has fallen out a little bit of the question and discussion we've been having as a specifically racialized form of production that has a global mapping in which different classes can be present across all of the spaces in which that mode of production is operative. I don't know if that was super helpful. I actually wondered if I could say one thing about the earlier question, which is I think sanctions are also a really important place to look for what forms of resistance. So, I mean, although they're in unsuccessful and incomplete ideas of what de-dollarization could look like, I mean, there are efforts, right, in Europe even, in order to persuade Iran that there's a there once the US pulls out of JCPOA, and then notwithstanding the fact that US sanctions and secondary sanctions alone do all the work that the multilateral sanctions that were lifted, you know, I mean, the lifting of the multilateral sanctions was supposed to make the possibility of reintegration in the world economy possible for Iran. Of course, the US immediately demonstrates that that's not true under Trump, because unilateral sanctions together with secondary sanctions do all the work of multilateral sanctions. So then what is the move of the remaining partners of the JCPOA? It's to say we can provide a de-dollarized investment vehicle that is going to be able to make it possible. That's Europe trying to do stuff, right? It's not small islands or some other outfit. It fails, but it's still the fact that that motivation exists, and that ties back to a point Ntina made at the very end of her comments, which is that the capacity of the US to continue to operate in this way is largely itself a function of how much the US chooses to defend, or how invested it is in maintaining dollar hegemony. And part of the problem the US has had in the face of few imperial constraints is that it's constantly acting in a way that actually undermines its own claim to hegemony by weaponizing the dollar to an extent that it actually motivates even its closest allies to have to find alternative vehicles.
Great, well, so with that said, we're at time, but of course we're facing lunch, so there's plenty of time to have some informal stuff. Thank you so much, sir.